I've learned that some places don't need shadows or monsters to feel dangerous. Sometimes the land itself carries a pulse you aren't meant to touch. And the night I camped along the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, I felt that pulse the moment the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. I didn't know it then, but the forest was already watching me, listening with a kind of patient hunger that only shows its teeth when you're completely alone. My name is Reed Halverson. I'm 42 years old, born and raised on the outskirts of Sacramento, and I've been taking solo RV trips since I was 21. Camping has always been my release valve, my way of stepping out of the noise of my life, especially after a year that had felt like one long, unraveling thread. I'd taken this October trip to clear my head, to get some distance from a job that had drained me dry and a relationship that had ended in a way I still didn't have words for. I needed quiet. I needed the openness of the mountains. I needed a place where nothing demanded anything from me. But the forest around Shasta doesn't give you peace. Not really. It gives you silence. A heavy, stretched thin silence that winds itself into your ears and settles in your bones. And on that first evening, as I parked my old Volkswagen Westphalia near an overlook that faced the ridgeline, that silence felt almost medicinal. I remember stepping out and breathing in the cold air, believing this trip would be the one that reset everything. I didn't yet understand that the forest gives silence only so it can hear you better. Even before twilight finished settling, something felt off. Not wrong, not threatening, just aligned strangely, like the world had shifted a few degrees, but I was the only one who noticed. The pine needles didn't rustle, the air didn't move. Even the warm orange fade of the sunset felt muted, like looking at it through glass. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd been tired, strung out, overthinking everything in my life lately. The forest wasn't strange. I was. But unease has a way of whispering the truth long before you can say it out loud. I cooked a simple dinner on my small propane stove, set up my fold-out chair, and tried to relax. I could see the faint outline of Mount Shasta far in the distance, its peak glowing like it stored its own cold light. The ridgeline in front of me cut a jagged silhouette against the sky. For a moment, I actually felt grateful, like maybe I'd chosen the perfect place to reset. Then the first sound drifted across the ridge, a long, low moan, somewhere between a wind gust and an animal cry, but stretched too evenly, too deliberately. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it didn't belong to anything I'd ever heard in the woods before. It carried a tone that almost sounded shaped, like someone sliding their voice against the grain of a word that wouldn't form. I froze in my chair, the hair on my arms lifted all at once. Mountain lion? Maybe, but it didn't rumble low enough. Elk? No, this sound had no breath to it. Wind through a canyon? There was no wind. I listened, but it didn't repeat. And the silence afterward was deeper than before, thick like it had weight. I let out a nervous laugh. I told myself not to be ridiculous. I'd spent my whole life hiking, camping, navigating remote backcountry trails alone. I knew the woods. I trusted them. And Shasta was full of stories, full of myths, full of people looking for meaning where there was only nature doing what nature does. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped hard. I climbed into the van, zipped up in my sleeping bag, and tried to settle. But my mind kept circling back to that sound, its shape, its rhythm, the strange restraint in it. It hadn't sounded like distress or aggression. It had sounded curious. Around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. No noise, no movement, just that prickling sensation that something in the dark had shifted. I lay still, listening. The van creaked softly as the cold tightened the frame. I breathed through my nose, slow and quiet. For a moment, I felt silly, hyper-aware from being alone, letting my imagination replay that earlier sound on loop. Then, from somewhere near the ridge, a single click echoed across the forest. Not a branch snapping, not a rock falling, a soft, deliberate click, like two stones tapped together. I pushed myself up on my elbows, another click, and another. each one spaced apart by several seconds, irregular but intentional. I strained to place the direction. It wasn't coming from the ground level or the tree line. It was coming from higher up, from somewhere along the ridge itself. Then the clicking stopped. I waited, barely breathing. 7, maybe 8 seconds of nothing. Then that same low moan rolled through the trees, longer this time, and closer, much closer. My chest tightened. There was no mistaking it now. That sound had purpose. It didn't carry like an animal call. It didn't resonate naturally. It felt directed. A flashlight felt suddenly inadequate. But I grabbed mine anyway, stepped out of the van, and pointed it toward the ridge. The beam hit the treetops first, motionless, then the slope, bare, then the near-ground brush, nothing. The forest looked exactly as it should look at midnight. Still, empty, indifferent. But the air felt wrong again, thicker, like something had stepped into the night with me and hadn't bothered to hide its presence. I told myself not to panic, not yet. I'd always been rational, always been steady. Fear is manageable when you give it something structured to hold on to. So I stepped back into the van, shut the door gently, and sat in the dark with only the faint red glow of my battery meter. I tried to reason with myself. Probably rocks slipping from the ridge, probably some distant animal echoing strangely in the valley, probably nothing at all. But the human mind knows when it's lying to itself. Around 1:30 a.m., the clicking returned. This time it came from 2 places at once, both high on the ridge and low near the tree lines, that like something had split into 2 or something else had joined it. 2 clicks on the ridge, a pause. 1 click closer to camp. Silence. Then a long, breathless moan that made the metal frame of the van shiver. My pulse hammered in my throat. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt attentive, like the silence itself was leaning forward to listen. I pressed my back against the van wall and closed my eyes, telling myself not to spiral, not to let old anxieties rise. Not after the year I'd had, not after everything had already been stripped away from me. I needed this trip to work. I needed it to give something back to me, not take something more. But fear doesn't negotiate. The clicking grew louder, closer, more precise. Then something scraped across the outside of the van. Just once, a slow, dragging scrape along the driver's side panel. Too long to be a branch, too clean to be an animal brushing past. It sounded like something rigid trailing lightly across the metal, almost testing it. I snapped on my flashlight and pointed it out the window. Nothing. No shape, no movement, not even dust stirred, just the ridge staring back at me in its silent, jagged outline. I felt the first real tremor of panic then, not from the sound, but from the realization that it wasn't behaving like any creature I knew. Animals don't test boundaries. Animals don't coordinate sounds. And animals sure as hell don't circle silently and then drag something across your vehicle just to see what you'll do. My breathing turned shallow. Sweat chilled on my back. And for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake coming out here alone. The scrape didn't repeat. The clicking stopped. The moaning fell away. The forest returned to stillness, as if whatever had been there simply withdrew once it knew I was awake. But silence can be more terrifying than noise. Hours passed like that, me sitting upright, flashlight in hand, waiting for the next sound, the next scrape, the next signal from the ridge, but nothing came. Dawn finally crept in, slow streaks of gray and gold across the horizon, and for a moment I convinced myself that everything I'd heard had been some strange atmospheric echo, until I stepped outside. On the driver's side, along the exact line where I'd heard the scrape, 4 narrow, perfectly parallel lines ran across the metal. Not deep, not jagged, but straight, deliberate, evenly spaced, like something with a rigid 4-pronged edge had traced a gentle path just to see how the van would respond. My stomach dropped. Whatever had been out there in the dark, it had touched the van on purpose. I stared at those marks for what felt like hours, my hands trembling, even as the sun began to warm the cold metal of the van. Every rational thought I tried to grasp slipped away. This wasn't a trick of light or a branch or my imagination. The forest had left its signature, and it wasn't subtle. I packed quickly. my hands shaking as I secured everything inside the van. Every instinct screamed to leave, to drive down the ridgeline and never look back. And yet, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to linger, to see if the ridge, the forest, would give another signal, another sound, a final answer to the question I didn't even fully understand. That was the mistake. The curiosity that always followed me into the woods. I started the engine, and the roar of the van felt almost obscene in the thick, heavy morning. I rolled backwards slowly, eyes flicking constantly to the tree line. Everything seemed ordinary in the daylight. The forest had shed its night cloak, returned to the mundane business of trees, wind, and distant birds. But I knew better. The marks, the clicks, the moan, they were proof that the forest had been awake while I slept, that it had been observing me, testing me. As I drove down the ridge road, the first real sunlight cutting into my eyes, I felt the weight of it lift slightly, though not completely. Fear doesn't leave so easily, not after it's had that kind of attention. I kept glancing at the side mirror, half expecting to see a shadow clinging to the ridge, some shape moving silently in perfect mimicry of my motions, but nothing came. The further I drove, the more I thought about how easy it is to dismiss fear. We like to tell ourselves it's irrational, that it's our mind playing tricks. But when you're alone in the forest and the forest decides to speak or act, you realize that fear is merely intelligence responding to the unknown. Survival instinct dressed in dread. When I finally reached a clearing near a small town off the highway, I stopped. I took a deep breath and leaned against the van. My hands were still trembling. My body was still humming with adrenaline. And I understood something I hadn't before. The forest hadn't just scared me, it had taught me. It had reminded me that solitude comes with responsibility, that curiosity can be dangerous, and that not all watchers are human, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. I never went back to that ridgeline, and I never will, but I carry the memory of it. The sound of those clicks, the long moan drifting down through the trees, the 4 perfect marks on my van, with me every time I camp now. I learned to respect the silence, to listen more than I speak, to trust instincts that I once dismissed as paranoia. There's a strange power in fear when it's earned, when it isn't manufactured by movies or stories. It sharpens your perception, awakens your senses, and forces you to confront the boundaries between what is safe and what is unknown. And in that confrontation, there's a kind of clarity, a raw, unnerving understanding that the world isn't always as tame as it looks on a map, in a photo, in a guidebook. I still camp. I still seek out quiet places where the mountains cut the sky and the rivers carve their paths. But I do it differently now. I watch the tree lines, I listen to the wind, I note the smallest irregularities in the forest's rhythm, and I never, ever approach curiosity with naive confidence. That night along the Shasta Trinity Ridgeline changed me. It reminded me that the woods can speak in ways you never expect, and that listening and respecting what you don't understand is sometimes the only way to survive. I don't know exactly what made those sounds or why the forest touched my van. Maybe it was a creature, maybe something older, maybe just the forest itself testing a human intruder. I'll never know. What I do know is that fear has a voice. And when you hear it, when it scratches at the edges of your consciousness, you can either ignore it or you can pay attention and live to tell the story. That night, I learned the difference. And as I drove away from the ridgeline, the van carrying me back into the light of the ordinary world, I felt a deep, permanent connection to the unseen, a recognition that some places, some nights will stay with you forever, not in memory alone, but in the pulse of your veins, in the way your hands tighten on a steering wheel, in the quiet tension that tells you, never take the unknown lightly. Sometimes the forest doesn't need to chase you. Sometimes it just waits. And that waiting is enough to make you understand the full weight of what it means to be small, alone, and awake in the dark. I will always remember the ridgeline. I will always remember the clicks, the moan, the marks on the van, and I will always remember the lesson it taught me. Respect the unknown. Fear it, listen to it, and never, ever think you understand it fully. Because some screams aren't meant to be answered, they're meant to be survived. I never thought a simple camping trip would make me question not just the world around me, but my own instincts. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and I've been RV camping across the United States for nearly a decade. I've learned to trust the rhythm of the road, the quiet conversations of rustling leaves, and the odd, distant howl of coyotes under a Texas moon. But that February in 2022 at Seminole Canyon Campground, something broke that rhythm. Something I couldn't have prepared for. The day had been crisp, the kind of cold that bites just enough to remind you that you're alive. I had parked my old Volkswagen camper on a narrow patch of cleared earth surrounded by the rugged limestone cliffs that give Seminole Canyon its name. The wind carried the scent of dry brush and the faint tang of river water down the canyon walls. It was serene, almost painfully so, the kind of serenity that makes you feel like you're invisible to the world. Except that, apparently, I wasn't. By mid-afternoon, I noticed him, a camper set up a few sites over, a man in his late 40s, graying hair and a weathered jacket. He seemed normal enough at first glance, the kind of solitary figure you see in the backcountry, quietly tending to a campfire or adjusting a tarp. But there was something slightly off. He never made direct eye contact, always averted gaze, shifting hands nervously. That first night, I caught him standing at the edge of his campsite, staring in my direction long after I thought he had gone to bed. I shook it off. Isolation does strange things to your imagination. My camper felt safe, insulated, the metallic hum of the fridge a lullaby against the silence outside. Yet, as I tried to sleep, I heard the faintest creak. Not from the wind, not from the old camper itself, but something deliberate, slow, stepping through the brush near my door. My heart kicked, but I told myself it was an animal. Coyotes, maybe, or a raccoon scavenging for scraps. Morning brought a sense of relief I couldn't shake. Over coffee, I watched him again from across the gap in the sights. He seemed normal, packing up, tying down ropes, moving like any other camper. And yet, when I glanced back at my own site, I had the impossible feeling he'd been watching me all morning, silent, patient, like a shadow waiting for permission to step closer. I spent the day hiking the canyon trails, trying to distract myself, the cliffs' sun-bleached faces jagged and indifferent. But no matter how far I walked, that unease clung. When I returned in the late afternoon, my campfire still smoldering, I saw him again, this time closer. Too close. Not on his own site, but just at the edge of mine, crouched behind a boulder, peering out as if testing my attention. My pulse spiked. I called out, trying to sound casual. "Hey, everything all right?" No answer. Just the wind whispering through the bare branches. By nightfall, I made sure every lock, every latch on the camper was secure. I paced inside, listening to the dark outside, imagining, hoping even that it was nothing. Then came the knocks. Soft at first, tentative, like someone testing a door that might not even exist. Tap, tap, tap. They came from outside, around the back of my camper. Each pause stretched longer, a heartbeat suspended in the chill night air. I debated stepping outside, debated calling the ranger station, debated whether I was losing my mind. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocks stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating, pressing against the aluminum walls of my Volkswagen. I couldn't sleep that night. Every rustle, every shifting shadow became him, or maybe him and someone else. My imagination began to betray me. Each sound, each movement in the brush became a story my mind was eager to tell, a story where I was being watched, evaluated, and tested. I woke to the smell of smoke, acrid and sharp. My fire had been extinguished, ashes cold to the touch, but I caught movement beyond the campsite, a figure retreating into the canyon, deliberately careful not to reveal too much. I grabbed my binoculars. The man, my neighbor. I wanted to confront him, demand answers, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay, to assert normalcy, while another, deeper, older whispered that some questions are safer left unasked. The rest of that day passed in tension. I packed extra gear, tightened straps, and kept my phone close, though service in the canyon was spotty at best. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of him, just far enough to be unnerving. A shadow behind a tree, a reflection in a canyon puddle. Never close, never direct, but always present. By the third night, the dread had evolved into something heavier. He didn't knock this time. Instead, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunched along the narrow path to my camper. Slow, careful, deliberate. I held my breath, counting each step as it circled my vehicle, then retreated. I didn't look out. I couldn't. My survival instincts wrestled with my curiosity, and for hours I simply waited, listening to the canyon's whispering secrets, imagining a man's eyes reflecting in the moonlight, calculating, watching, knowing I knew. The next morning, he was gone. No trace of him, no sign of where he had slept, what he had touched. I asked other campers, but no one had seen him arrive, and no one had seen him leave. I reported it to the ranger, who offered a shrug and a story about transient campers in the area, men who come and go like ghosts, but their words didn't settle my mind. They never do. Driving away from Seminole Canyon, I kept my eyes on every bend, every shadow. I replayed the encounter over and over, trying to rationalize, to make sense of a human presence that defied all explanation. And in the quiet of my Volkswagen, I realized something deeper. Fear isn't just about danger. It's about the feeling of being observed, evaluated, understood in ways you're not prepared to handle. It's about the collapse of certainty, even in the places you think you know. I've returned to Texas since then, to other campsites, other canyons, but that night in Seminole Canyon lingers. Not as a ghost story, not as folklore, but as a lesson. Trust your instincts, respect the quiet spaces, and remember that not every neighbor is as they appear. Some vanish, leaving only the impression of themselves, and a reminder that the line between normal and dangerous is thinner than we ever imagine. I never thought a place so empty could feel so alive. My name is Lucas. I'm 32, and I've spent years chasing quiet spaces in my VW camper, seeking the kind of solitude most people only dream of. That August in 2020, I found myself wheeling my old van across the scorched expanse of Nevada's Black Rock Flats, where the ground stretches like pale, cracked skin under an endless sky. The heat pressed against the van, baking the metal and making the horizon shimmer in deceptive waves. The isolation was seductive at first, a siren song of absolute freedom, but it has a way of whispering, coaxing the tiniest fear into something unbearable. I parked my VW near an outcropping of jagged stones, far enough from the distant campers so I could pretend I was entirely alone. The van's engine hummed down, the silence settling in like a soft, heavy blanket. My first night was ordinary, the kind of quiet that lulls you into thinking the world is asleep. But even then, I noticed the radio. Static. A low, almost imperceptible buzz that didn't belong to any station. I fiddled with the knobs, thinking maybe my old van's electronics were just aging poorly. But the static never went away. It hovered, persistent, like a distant warning I couldn't yet decipher. By the second night, I realized the static was more than a malfunction. I was cooking dinner when the radio flared suddenly, cutting through the hum of my small stove. A voice, low and distorted, almost swallowed by the buzzing, had whispered a string of numbers, coordinates maybe, or something else entirely. I froze, the spatula still in my hand, staring at the small screen as the signal vanished into silence. I told myself it was nothing. Nevada has weird electrical fields. My mind was tired from the heat and the endless miles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one watching. The wind began that night, creeping across the flat like fingernails scraping thin metal. At first, it was a soft whistle, then a howl that made the van tremble, rattling my cupboards and shaking the lights. Every gust seemed to carry a faint echo, a resonance of the voice that had been on the radio. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dashboard, waiting for the static to return. And when it did, it was worse. A high-pitched keening that burrowed through my skull, accompanied by the unmistakable clatter of something outside, something pacing around the van just beyond the circle of my headlights. I wrestled with denial. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a coyote had found the scent of food. Rationality fought the creeping dread, but the fear was a living thing now, feeding off my imagination. I started keeping the van locked, but the static would flare whenever I stepped outside. The electronics glitched in synchrony. The fridge would hum erratically, the lights flickered, delay, and even the tiny fan over the bed skipped beats like it was listening. And I swear, that when I peered into the darkness, I saw figures moving just at the edge of my vision, shadows stretching unnaturally, vanishing whenever I blinked. I tried sleep, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the mind does not rest in the desert. Around 3 a.m., the radio erupted in a scream of static. Then, a voice, unmistakable now, clear and icy, "Do not leave." My heart stopped. The van's metal frame seemed to constrict around me. My hands shook, and the sense of being observed was no longer a whisper. It was a pulse, a rhythm in my bones. I realized I was no longer alone, and whatever was out there did not want me to leave. Or perhaps it did not want me to stay. I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the bed, listening. The desert seemed to inhale. Each breath of wind carried a vibration, a pulse synchronized with my own heartbeat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe I'd stumbled into some old military testing ground. But the VW was old, stubbornly analog, the kind of van where interference would rarely be so consistent. And yet every electrical signal, every creak of the chassis, every rustle outside reinforced the warning in my chest. There was something here, unseen but attentive, and it did not like being ignored. By morning, I was exhausted, almost zombified, yet I knew I could not simply wait for it to pass. I drove out, circling the flat slowly, searching for patterns. The radio sputtered, and through the static, I began hearing faint repetitions, the numbers again, almost like a code. My instincts screamed to follow them, yet reason argued the opposite. I camped on the move, letting the van's engine be my companion, and each hour brought new distortions. The temperature swung unpredictably, the sky flickered with heat mirages that looked like moving figures, and in the periphery of my eyes, the desert itself seemed to bend. I realized then the truth. The Black Rock Flats is not empty. It reacts. The electronics, the van, even my own mind, it all became a conduit. The more I resisted, the more insistent the interference. The numbers on the radio became clearer, a sequence that made no sense until I mapped them in the dirt beside the van. They weren't coordinates. They were warnings, not directions, but boundaries, invisible lines I was being cautioned against crossing. Nightfall brought another escalation. The wind turned sharp, slicing through the van's insulation. The static returned in waves, now accompanied by low, unplaceable groans. My senses sharpened, fear tethering me to every sound. The groans had rhythm, deliberate steps around the VW, circling, retreating, advancing. I could feel a gaze pressing on me from the void. I gripped the wheel, my body rigid, my mind racing through every survival instinct I had learned on years of solo trips. Sleep was impossible. Denial, now abandoned, was replaced by tense hyper-awareness. I became part of the environment, every creak of the van, every gust of wind, every shadow under the moonlight, a signal I could not ignore. By the third night, I understood something crucial. The desert itself tests you. The electronics glitching, the whispering static, the voices, they were challenges, boundaries I could not see, lines I could not cross. And I was not meant to be reckless. I stayed awake, tracking the patterns, learning the rhythms of this strange, sentient place. The static, once a harbinger of terror, became a guide. I followed its pulses cautiously, avoiding areas that seemed to hum with warning, steering clear of the places where my instincts screamed danger louder than any voice. I don't know what I would have done if I had ignored the warnings. Perhaps I would have left and never looked back, or perhaps curiosity would have been fatal. By dawn, I had learned to read the signals. The static, the groans, the shifting temperature, they were all part of a living map, a system of survival written in subtle, terrifying code. My fear became vigilance. My dread became preparation. The desert had humbled me, and in its quiet cruelty, I discovered a lesson no guidebook could teach. The fourth night arrived with a suffocating stillness, the kind that makes your own heartbeat echo like a drum in an empty cathedral. I could feel the desert waiting as if it had been biding its time, watching me adapt to its signals, testing whether I had learned enough to survive. The VW sat heavy on the cracked earth, its metal body humming faintly as if in conversation with the static on the radio. I had become attuned to its rhythms. A rise in pitch meant movement beyond the headlights. A stutter signaled proximity. A long, low growl warned of an unseen presence too close for comfort. I moved with the van, small adjustments to my route, careful not to disrupt the patterns I had begun to understand. Then it came. A sudden flare of light across the horizon, unnatural and jagged, snapping the darkness into a fractured mosaic of shadows. The radio screamed in response, static shredding through the quiet like broken glass, and the numbers that had once been distant, whispers, now rang out in sharp, clipped tones. They weren't just warnings anymore. They were instructions. I couldn't comprehend them fully, but instinct drove me to obey. I steered the VW along the pale flats, tracing the lines I could only feel, avoiding the invisible boundaries marked by the desert's invisible hand. Something shifted in the wind then, a subtle change that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a gust, not really, but a pulse that carried across the flat like a heartbeat too slow, too deliberate. I knew without thinking that I was being followed, not by an animal, not by a person, but by the consciousness of the place itself. The static flared again, and for a heartbeat, the numbers morphed into a voice, almost human but warped, distorted, filled with a warning that bypassed reason. Do not cross. You are not ready. My palms were slick on the steering wheel, my breath ragged. Every rational thought told me to leave, to accelerate blindly and escape the expanse, but my curiosity, my survival instinct, kept me tethered to the code. I parked briefly near a ridge, the van's headlights illuminating nothing but the flat, broken earth. I could hear it now, clearly over the static. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, circling the VW. Not animal, not mechanical. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, and I realized that the desert had found a new way to communicate. My mind raced to understand, to interpret. Every shadow, every flicker of movement outside became a piece of the puzzle. I realized then that fear was not my enemy. It was a tool, sharpening me, heightening my senses, teaching me to read the imperceptible signs that had been invisible before. And then the van's electronics failed completely. Lights flickered once, twice, then died. The radio went silent. I was plunged into darkness so complete it felt solid, pressing against me from all sides. The footsteps stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My own pulse roared in my ears. For a moment, the desert was a blank, a void, and I understood in a way I hadn't before. This was a test of presence, of awareness. The desert didn't just want me to survive, it wanted me to understand. I lit a small flashlight, its beam trembling in my shaking hand. The static returned, softer now, guiding me. Slowly, I followed the sequence of signals, moving in the rhythm I had learned. The numbers repeated, the instructions clear in ways I could feel more than see. Avoid the mirages, respect the boundaries, never look directly at the shadows. Step by careful step, I moved across the flat, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. The footsteps resumed, distant now, fading as I obeyed the invisible rules. By dawn, I was at the edge of the flats, the VW barely a silhouette against the rising sun. I stopped and looked back. The expanse behind me shimmered in the early light, ordinary again, silent, as if nothing had happened. The radio buzzed once, weakly, and then fell silent, leaving only the hum of the van's engine. I had survived, but I had learned that survival here was not about strength or speed. It was about attention, respect, and surrender to the subtle cues of the environment. The desert had tested me, had bent my perception, had forced me to confront fear in its purest form, and I had emerged not unscarred but enlightened. Driving away, I realized that the terror had been more than a challenge. It had been a revelation. The smallest signals, the faintest warnings, can carry truths more vital than any map or guidebook. The Black Rock Flats had no monsters in the traditional sense. Its horror was subtler, psychological, a haunting woven into the static of a radio, the flicker of lights, the pulse of the wind across endless broken earth. And it demanded awareness, vigilance, and humility from anyone who dared to wander its expanse. Now, months later, whenever I tune a radio in the middle of nowhere and catch the faintest hiss of static, I feel a twinge of recognition, a pulse of memory. I remember the boundaries I traced with trembling hands in the dust, the groans that circled the van like a living thing, the invisible rules that shaped the desert itself. And I know that the terror was not just in what I saw or heard, but in what I failed to understand at first. The desert and its warnings were alive in ways I could barely comprehend. I tell this story not to frighten, but to remind anyone who travels the solitary roads in a camper, in a van, in a quiet place that seems abandoned. Pay attention. Listen. Respect the signal.